A black teenager was slapped across the face mid-flight by a flight attendant who didn't bother to lower her voice when she called him a threat. That moment, violent, humiliating, unmistakably public, wasn't the beginning of the story, just the loudest crack in a wall that had been closing in long before takeoff. Before that slap, he had been pushed out of first class with a smile, had his name quietly deleted from the meal list, watched his belongings vanish without explanation, and endured 8 hours of calculated erasure, disguised as routine. He didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even flinch when passengers whispered around him, their glances heavy with judgment, their silence louder than the engines overhead. But beneath that stillness was a truth that would shatter every assumption made about who he was and why he was there. This wasn't just about race. It was about arrogance, power, and the systems that operate on both when no one is looking. If you're reading this, you're about to follow a story built on every injustice hidden behind professional smiles. Drop a like if you believe silence shouldn't be mistaken for weakness. Subscribe to follow the full story. And comment where you're watching from, because this isn't just one boy's story. It's a mirror held to us all. The morning air inside Jackson International's luxury terminal buzzed with silent competition. Luggage rolled softly across waxed marble. Shoes clicked with intent, and casual glances held judgments sharper than TSA scanners. Every corner of Gate 19's private lounge reflected wealth, not the loud, flashy kind, but the kind that dressed in quiet cashmere and drank espresso from porcelain. And in the middle of it all stood Keon Stratham, 17, alone. Dressed in neatly pressed tan slacks, a fitted charcoal pullover, and crisp white sneakers that had never touched dirt. His posture was unshaken, his expression calm, his presence composed but conspicuous in all the ways that drew attention without effort. He carried no designer logos, wore no gold chains, held no phone to his ear, but somehow, that just made him more noticeable. Keon approached the boarding desk with his ticket in hand, a physical card printed on a platinum-glined stock that only the highest-tier Altair Airlines members ever saw. First class, 1A, no travel companion listed, no guardian, just his name, solitary and bold. Behind the desk stood Meredith Langley, her professional proud out of her. She was the kind of woman who believed in order, and her definition of order came with spoken rule. Her uniform was flawless, her smile practiced, her eyes sharp. When she saw Keon step forward, her expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed. She took his ticket without greeting, reading his name with a slight pause, flipping it over as if expecting something to be missing. She tapped the screen of her tablet slowly, carefully, and the pause stretched too long. Passengers behind Keon murmured, some shifting their weight impatiently. One man adjusted the strap of his briefcase, glancing toward the gate, then at his watch. A woman in sunglasses tilted her head, pretending not to eavesdrop while clearly doing just that. Meredith tapped again, then again. Still, she didn't speak. Finally, with deliberate calm, she looked up. Her voice was low, smooth, and falsely polite. She explained that there seemed to be a minor discrepancy with the reservation. Something small, probably a system error. Nothing to worry about, but she would need to double-check. Keon simply nodded once. He knew the tone, knew the script, knew how this played out. She handed his ticket back without confirming boarding and asked him to step aside. Just for a moment, just while she checked a few things, just while she consulted a supervisor. There was no supervisor visible, no call made, no verifying happening. Instead, Meredith gestured subtly to a younger gate agent who positioned himself at the entrance, physically blocking the boarding path. The velvet rope barrier hadn't been drawn, but it didn't need to be. The body language said enough. Keon stood beside the counter in silence, holding his bag at his side, eyes focused forward. He didn't argue, didn't interrupt. He waited. More passengers arrived. A couple entered holding hands, their matching black travel sets wheeled behind them. A businessman in a gray overcoat stepped past, barely glancing at Keon. The gate began boarding Group A. No announcement was made about the delay, no mention of any irregularities. Meredith continued her duties smoothly, scanning out her tickets, offering polished smiles, handing out greetings like she was reading from a script. She never once looked back at Keon. After 10 minutes, she approached him again. She told him that unfortunately, due to incomplete verification of guardian authorization, he would not be permitted to board first class unaccompanied. It wasn't a matter of his behavior or credentials, she explained, but rather a system limitation. She gestured at the terminal screen beside her with vague frustration. The screen wasn't showing anything at all. She offered him an alternative, a temporary reassignment to a seat in the main cabin. Just for now, just until a flight supervisor could override the policy mid-air. She emphasized that this was an accommodation, one she hoped he appreciated. He didn't move immediately. She repeated herself, this time louder, as if the volume might shift authority. He picked up his bag slowly and followed the younger agent, who guided him away from the first-class door. A few passengers watched, confusion written across their faces. They had seen the platinum ticket. They had watched the exchange, but no one said anything. No one ever did. The walkway to economy was narrower, less polished. The lighting dimmed slightly the farther back he walked. When he reached the seat he'd been assigned, 27B, it was clear no thought had gone into the placement. Wedged between a man whose elbows refused to acknowledge shared space and a woman with 3 carry-os stacked beneath her feet, Keon eased into the seat with control that betrayed nothing. His carry-on, which had previously rested comfortably beside him in the lounge, was taken by the attendant and forced into an overhead compartment 3 rows away. He was offered a courtesy bottle of water without a cap and told to fasten his seatbelt. The junior attendant left before he could speak. In the front cabin, Meredith sipped her coffee and resumed her pre-flight checks. She didn't mention the reassignment to the captain. She didn't log it as an incident. As far as she was concerned, the disruption had been handled. Keon sat in silence, shoulders straight, his hands resting on his thighs. His view now looked directly into the back of a stained seat. The window beside him was fogged with fingerprints. The air smelled of reheated cheese and recycled breath. He didn't complain. He didn't signal for help. He just stared forward, unblinking. His shoulders were square, his spine straight, his face unreadable, but beneath that calm exterior, something pressed like a cold weight on his chest. The first-class seat he had rightfully purchased now sat occupied by someone else. Someone whose only qualification was that he appeared to belong. Keon had not shouted, had not protested, had not drawn attention. He had obeyed every instruction, responded with calm, allowed the indignity to settle in silence. And still, the system had found a way to reject him. 15 minutes into the flight, a slender male flight attendant approached Keon's row with a tablet in hand. He barely looked at Keon, instead turning to the other passengers in the row, confirming snacks and beverages. Keon waited, but the attendant skipped him entirely. When the cart came through, Keon quietly requested water. The attendant raised a brow, glanced down at the screen and said, his name was not listed for that service. The passenger beside Keon, who had just unwrapped a protein bar and was sipping on a ginger ale, looked at him with a mix of amusement and pity but said nothing. Keon said nothing either. He simply turned toward the window smeared with fingerprints and watched the clouds pass like waves of mist below. Outside was quiet, soft, limitless. Inside was tension masked as routine. By the time the fasten seatbelt sign turned off, passengers had begun to relax. The man on Keon's right was asleep already, his mouth slightly open, head tilted back. The woman on the left had reclined her seat and was whispering into her headset, one hand clutching a travel brochure. Keon remained still, not because he was comfortable, but because movement seemed unwelcome. He reached slowly for his satchel, but before he could unzip it, the same junior attendant who had seated him appeared beside the row. He crouched beside Keon and said, low enough for only him to hear, that he needed to move his bag to the overhead bin for safety. Keon pointed out that it contained his documents and identification, but the attendant insisted. Within moments, the bag was gone, relocated to a compartment that Keon couldn't see from where he sat. It wasn't about safety. It was about visibility. Even his belongings weren't allowed to remain with him. Back in first class, Meredith Langley completed her service rounds. She moved like a dancer through a familiar routine, offering sparkling water, warm towels, and carefully plated meals to the passengers reclining in wide leather seats. Seat 1A, the one Keon had originally been assigned, was now occupied by a man in his 50s with a silver watch and a pressed navy suit. He spoke loudly to a business associate across the aisle, oblivious to the seat's original owner. Meredith offered him a second glass of wine, complimented his cufflinks, and made no mention of the passenger who had been displaced. Meanwhile, Keon's new seatmate returned from the laboratory and attempted to squeeze past him. Her elbow hit his arm as she sat down, but she didn't acknowledge it. Her gaze passed over him like he was an empty seat, a space without meaning. Another attendant passed by, paused, and looked directly at Keon. She squinted, frowned slightly, and asked for his name. When he gave it, she looked at her tablet, tapped the screen, then informed him that according to the manifest, his presence wasn't logged in that seat. She asked if he had boarded the plane with the correct group. Keon, remaining calm, explained that he had been reassigned by staff prior to boarding due to a stated discrepancy. She told him to remain seated and disappeared. She did not return. 30 minutes passed. No drink, no food, no inquiry. He had become a ghost in a metal chamber, flying through clouds with no identity acknowledged. The discomfort wasn't just physical, it was systematic. Each time someone looked past him, each time his presence was erased from the record, it chipped away at something deeper. A man 2 rows ahead asked for extra pretzels and received them instantly. A woman behind requested a different drink and got it without delay. But when Keon again tried to catch the eye of the attendant passing with the drink cart, he was told they were out of the selection. He wanted another hour in the air. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing turbulence ahead. Seatbelts clicked across the cabin. Keon remained rigid, his hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead as the aircraft lightly shook. Overhead lights flickered briefly before stabilizing. In first class, Meredith moved quickly to secure trays, adjusting napkins and smiling as she moved through the plush rows. She didn't glance at the back. She didn't remember his name. When turbulence ended and movement resumed, Keon finally stood to stretch. His knees stiffened from the cramped space. As he reached for his overhead bag to check the documents inside, the overhead compartment was empty. He blinked. Check the next. Still nothing. He turned to the attendant, who was pushing an empty cart down the aisle. When he asked about the bag, the attendant said it had likely been relocated during earlier turbulence for safety. He gestured vaguely down the aisle, somewhere forward. Keon sat back down. His name had vanished from the seat list. His bag had vanished from the compartment. His dignity had vanished between the polished walls of forced protocol. The flight continued. 2 hours in, the food trays came through again. When they reached Keon's row, the attendant asked his seatmate what she wanted, then skipped directly to the next row. Keon leaned forward and spoke clearly. The attendant frowned, looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, and said the meals had been counted according to manifest, and his name wasn't listed for that row. It was said with professionalism, but there was no offer of correction. No question of fairness, just policy, printed somewhere invisible, used now as shield. His body ached from immobility, but he refused to show fatigue. Across the aisle, passengers leaned into pillows and reclined seats. He remained perfectly straight, the rigid frame of someone who knew that relaxing would only invite more dismissal. His eyes, though quiet, burned with a slow and quiet fire. The smell of reheated pasta still lingered in the air, clashing faintly with the citrus tang of disinfectant sprayed earlier in the flight. Keon shifted slightly to loosen the belt across his lap. A flight attendant, the same one who had redirected his carry-on earlier, passed by and glanced down. Without slowing his pace, he gestured for Keon to refasten the belt. Even though the seatbelt sign remained off, Keon complied. He made no argument. Arguing meant confrontation. Confrontation meant escalation. Escalation meant being labeled a problem. He had seen it happen before. To friends, to classmates, to men he admired. One misstep, even something as small as raising a hand or a voice, was enough to validate their bias. So he sat still, said nothing, and waited. Mid-cabin, Meredith Langley emerged from first class, clipboard in hand. She moved through the aisles slowly, with the self-assured grace of someone above scrutiny. She stopped at intervals, speaking softly to attendants, nodding at selected passengers, confirming names and seat numbers. It appeared routine hadn't acknowledged the reassignment. Now, her steps carried her slowly toward the economy section. Keon kept his gaze straight ahead, sensing her presence before she reached his row. When she arrived at 27B, she didn't speak to him directly. Instead, she addressed the attendant beside her, whispering as she gestured toward Keon's seat. The attendant nodded. Meredith then turned and walked away, not a glance exchanged. Moments later, the attendant returned with a small plastic bag containing a half-finished bottle of water and what looked like a cold sandwich. He leaned in and, with the faintest hint of apology, informed Kiona that there had been a delay in verifying his dietary preferences. Since no formal meal was available to him, this would suffice until arrival. He placed the items on the tray table without asking permission, then turned to leave. The sandwich was unwrapped, its bread flattened on one side, the paper napkin beneath it already beginning to tear from condensation. It looked more like something retrieved from a forgotten drawer than prepared for a paying passenger. He stared at it for a moment. He felt his stomach twist, not from hunger but from the message it carried. He hadn't demanded special treatment, but this was intentional. This was symbolic. The food, the delivery, the silence around it, all calculated to send one message: you don't belong. He didn't touch the sandwich. He closed the tray slowly, pushed the plastic bag to the side and resumed his original position. The woman to his left shifted slightly, catching a glimpse of the meal before wrinkling her nose and adjusting her scarf. She said nothing. A man behind him coughed and chuckled quietly, whispering to someone next to him. Keon heard a muttered joke, low but clear enough to understand. It wasn't about the sandwich. It was about him. An hour passed. The lights dimmed further, and the hum of the engines deepened. Keon's legs were beginning to cramp, but space was limited. He glanced toward the aisle, hoping to stand and stretch, but the path was temporarily blocked by the beverage cart. As he waited, the same junior attendant from earlier reappeared. He approached with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes, and asked Keon to follow him toward the rear galley for a moment. No reason was given. The tone was casual but firm. Keon unbuckled his belt and stood, walking slowly behind the attendant. The galley space was cramped and dimly lit, with cabinets on both sides and a cart half loaded with snacks. The attendant gestured to the corner and informed Keon that, during his reassignment, one of the baggage compartments had become misaligned. He claimed it needed inspection. It made no sense. It had nothing to do with Keon's assigned seat, nor with any procedure he recognized. Still, Keon nodded, waiting silently as the attendant opened the compartment, reached in, and pulled out a folded blanket, clearly unused. The attendant then turned and handed it to Keon without comment. No explanation followed. He simply nodded, turned away, and left Keon standing alone. Keon returned to his seat with the blanket in hand, unsure why it had been given to him. He placed it on his lap untouched. The gesture felt empty, like a hollow attempt at appearing humane after hours of subtle cruelty. There was no kindness in it, only control. Halfway through the return to his seat, another passenger stood and stepped aside to let him pass. It was a man in his 60s, wearing a brown corduroy jacket. As Keon passed, the man looked him up and down, then made a comment under his breath, something about how flying used to mean something, how standards had changed. Keon kept walking. He didn't turn. He didn't respond, but each word landed like a stone in his chest. The tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even hostile. The plane had transformed into a theater of silent injustice, with each passing minute reinforcing his role as the unwanted guest. His stomach ached from the absence of food, but the hunger didn't bother him as much as the certainty that this treatment wasn't accidental. It was a system at work, an order of invisible rules that required no loud voices to be enforced, no damned silence. Keon had grown up understanding that some spaces didn't need to be locked to be off-limits. The locks existed in the minds of those who believed they owned the air, the walls, the definitions of who belonged and who didn't. The cabin lights dimmed further as the crew initiated the overnight segment of the flight. Passengers reclined, arranged neck pillows, closed eyes, and sought sleep. A recorded message played softly, reminding everyone to remain seated, to keep aisles clear, and to respect the quiet hours. The voice, calm and automated, echoed faintly above the hum of engines. Keon leaned back slightly. Not here, not now. Every muscle in his back remained tense, his mind alert, watching for the next small act meant to reinforce his displacement. He had not expected kindness, but the methodical way his existence had been reduced to inconvenience, then ghosted from, system duper fashion, gnawed at something deeper than pride. It reached into his sense of being, challenging the very idea that his presence mattered. 20 minutes into quiet hours, a soft shuffling sound drew Keon's attention toward the front of the cabin. A passenger, heavyset and middle-aged, shuffled down the aisle toward the lavatory, brushing shoulders as he moved. As he passed Keon's row, he paused slightly, glancing down at him. There was no greeting, just a smirk and a quiet chuckle, followed by a comment meant only for himself, but loud enough to be heard. The words were vague but carried the weight of ridicule. Keon remained still. The passenger continued walking, and within seconds, the sound of the lavatory door clicking shut signaled his disappearance. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, it was the understanding that this man, a stranger, felt entitled to treat him as less than human without fear of consequence. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to insult openly. His smirk said it all. He had read the room, seen the hierarchy enforced by the staff, and acted accordingly. Keon had become the symbol of exclusion, not through anything he had done, but through what others had allowed themselves to believe about him. Later, when Keon stood to retrieve his satchel again, hoping it might have been returned to a closer compartment, a new flight attendant intercepted him near row 20. She looked younger than the others, with eyes that flickered nervously when they met his. She asked, in a hushed tone, where he was going. Keon explained his bag had been moved and he was attempting to locate it. Her brows furrowed. She looked behind him, as if expecting someone else to be responsible for him. Her response came wrapped in policy. Please return to your seat. Movement during quiet hours was discouraged. When he tried to explain again, she interrupted and repeated the same line with firmer cadence. It wasn't just about rules, it was about place. He turned without protest and walked back to 27B, settling again into the space that felt smaller with every passing hour. His satchel, with his ID, wallet, charger, and flight credentials, remained out of reach. A short time later, the same attendant returned, walking quickly past his row and slowing only briefly. Keon raised a hand slightly, not to wave her down, but to signal readiness, to be seen. Her eyes passed over him. She kept walking. It was more than neglect now. It was absence, as if he had become a blank seat, a body that didn't factor into the flow of service. The rows ahead received soft blankets, bottles of water, gentle words. Rows behind him were addressed by name, but his row sat in silence, unacknowledged. Even his seatmate, once mildly amused by his presence, now leaned away slightly, adjusting her blanket to form a physical barrier. Their tray with the untouched sandwich still sat closed. No one came to clear it. Around him, the darkness deepened. Outside the window, the night sky blanketed the world in silence. The clouds below appeared silver under moonlight, beautiful in their stillness. Keon leaned against the window slightly, feeling the cold against his cheek. He breathed slowly, focusing on the rhythm of the engine, trying to anchor himself in something other than the quiet cruelty of human behavior. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to disconnect from the fluorescent-lit world that had decided he didn't exist. He didn't know how much time had passed when a soft knock on the shoulder roused him. His eyes opened to see yet another crew member, one he hadn't seen before. This one held a checklist and asked in a neutral tone for his seat number. Keon answered. The attendant frowned slightly, scribbled something, then said there had been a discrepancy in the manifest. His name had not been recorded for any meal preference, any service tier, or any seat preference. The tone was clinical, not accusatory, but it carried the weight of rejection. Keon asked for the first time if that could be corrected. The answer came quickly, not mid-flight. He nodded. The attendant didn't apologize, he simply left. By now, the rejection wasn't just institutional, it had become intimate. The kind that crept into his skin, into his lungs, into the slow exhale of breath that no longer carried the assumption of fairness. He was now a ghost aboard a vessel that had recorded him as luggage. The passengers beside him had stopped pretending to notice. Even the man who had earlier joked, as he passed, now walked freely, brushing by Keon with indifference. When Keon reached again for the overhead bin, just to stretch his shoulders, a woman in the next row narrowed her eyes and shifted her purse protectively. She didn't say anything, but her face told a story she believed about him, one that had no connection to who he actually was. The same story Meredith had decided the moment she saw him at the gate. The same story the attendants had written silently with every skipped gesture. Keon sat back again, retreating further into silence. He didn't look for water. He didn't seek food. He didn't ask about his satchel. The passengers around him had accepted the narrative written by omission, a quiet choreography where they danced around his existence, not from hatred, but from practiced neglect. It was easier for them not to see him, and by now, it was easier for Keon not to expect to be seen. Still, he sat, composed, his presence anchored in resolve, though each moment carved deeper into the well of humiliation rising slowly inside his chest. As the aircraft neared the halfway mark of the transcontinental flight, the crew returned to duty with a renewed sense of order. The intercom flickered to life with announcements about international customs forms, connecting flights, and arrival estimates. The tone was smooth, efficient, and detached, delivered in English and French, but none of it registered with Keon, who had already rehearsed in his mind how this experience would be remembered, not for its distance or destination, but for the quiet demolition of dignity hidden beneath protocol. The flight attendants moved through the aisles again, this time with clipboards and customs packets. Most passengers were handed documents without hesitation. Keon raised his hand politely when his row was skipped again, and the nearest crew member, a woman with sharp features and glossy hair pulled tight, barely glanced at him before shaking her head and stating that forms were distributed based on listed passengers. When Keon gave his name, her face shifted. She asked for identification, which he could not produce, since his bag was still missing. Her eyes narrowed, and within seconds, she tapped her comm device, whispering into her collar with the precision of someone used to escalating perceived problems. A moment later, two crew members approached, one male tall and square-shouldered, the other female, silent and observant. They asked Keon to stand, requested that he step into the rear galley for verification. No explanation, no offer of support, just a direct order spoken with the calm of practiced procedure. Keon stood without protest, aware of the eyes beginning to rise from their seats as he moved down the narrow aisle. The whisper of fabric, the shuffling of shoes, the tilt of a head, all signs that the audience had returned, and this time they would see something. Not the quiet exclusion of skipped service, not the invisible cruelty of denied meals or forgotten names, but a scene, a disruption, a moment to reinforce the myth of their own correctness. He passed them one by one, their expressions ranging from polite disinterest to veiled satisfaction. Injustice was more palatable when dressed as procedure, and everyone had learned to eat it in silence. In the galley, the air was colder. Metal trays lined the walls. Storage carts rattled faintly with the motion of the plane. Keon stood against the wall, while the male attendant spoke again, this time more formal, explaining that he had been flagged due to discrepancies in the manifest, unusual behavior, and a lack of proper credentials. The tone was not hostile, but it was rehearsed, clinical. Keon opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to offer context, but before he could finish the sentence he was interrupted by the female attendant, who asked him to remove his shoes. Confused, he paused, unsure if he had heard correctly, and the male attendant repeated the instruction, this time slower, as if speaking to someone unable to process commands. Keon, stunned, complied. He removed his shoes carefully and handed them over, watching as they were inspected without ceremony. They searched the shoes in silence, holding them upside down, tapping the soles against the wall, shining a small flashlight inside. When nothing was found, they returned them wordlessly, but made no apology. Instead, they handed him a small packet containing a customs form and told him to complete it upon return to his seat. There was no explanation for the search, no acknowledgement of its inappropriateness, no recognition of how it might feel to be publicly asked to remove footwear at 36,000 feet. The message had been delivered without words. He had been marked. On his return to the aisle, the scene had changed. Passengers now leaned openly into the aisle, eyes following his steps. Some whispered, others frowned. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, not out of empathy, but as a reflexive response to perceived disturbance. The man who had chuckled earlier made a remark as Keon passed, this time louder, not masked by the hum of the engine. It wasn't vulgar. It wasn't loud enough to be actionable. But it carried the tone of amusement, of superiority, disguised as casual commentary. Keon ignored it, slipping back into 27B, now fully aware that his role on this flight had been cemented. the problem passenger, the anomaly, the story to be told later in a half-remembered anecdote. He sat with his shoes loosely tied, the customs form untouched in his lap. His seatmate leaned farther away now, her body turned distinctly toward the aisle, her legs crossed, her expression stiff. The attendant passed once more and this time didn't even pause to acknowledge him. He had become the non-person. Keon looked out the window again, but this time the clouds looked different, the sky a darker shade of indifference, the stars more distant. He no longer felt like he was flying. He felt like he was being carried by something that refused to see him, refused to hear him, refused to accept that his name had ever been printed on that boarding pass in the first place. The plane dipped slightly as it began adjusting altitude. The intercom buzzed with routine updates about estimated landing times, baggage claims, and gate connections. Ian didn't listen. His focus had shifted inward, away from the hostile choreography of his surroundings, away from the theater of silent condemnation. He had done nothing wrong. He had violated no rules, raised no voice, broken no law, yet here he was, shoeless for a time, mealless for hours, nameless in a digital record, presenceless in the eyes of those tasked with his care. His muscles remained taut from holding back response, his jaw clenched from the restraint required to survive an injustice that was executed with clinical elegance. He had not raised his voice, not once, and yet the flight attendants had managed to turn every interaction into another calculated strike against his dignity. The shoe inspection in the galley had become the tipping point, and now as the cabin filled with activity once again, Keon knew more was coming. The system wasn't finished with him yet. He could feel it, heavy, in the way eyes glanced his way, only to look off with forced disinterest, heavy in the quiet avoidance of the crew each time they passed his row without stopping. And then it arrived. A new flight attendant with glossy black hair and a tight smile pushed the cart into his section. She moved efficiently, asking each passenger their preference, exchanging trays, and offering pre-packaged cutlery wrapped in thin plastic. When she reached Keon's row, she leaned down slightly to ask the woman beside him about her meal choice. The woman responded, received her food, and adjusted her tray. The attendant turned to Keon, her smile fading subtly as she glanced at the manifest screen attached to the cart. She looked him over as if seeing a smudge on a clean surface, then checked the tray inventory before reaching below and producing a clear plastic container, one that didn't match the others being served. She handed it to Keon without a word. He took it in silence and placed it on the tray table in front of him. The container was smaller than the others. Inside it was a single sandwich, unwrapped and already slightly dry, its crusts curled upward like they'd been exposed to the air for hours. No drink accompanied it, no napkin, no utensils, just the sandwich carelessly packed and delivered like an afterthought. Keon stared at it, unblinking. The flight attendant had already moved on, serving others with her bright, harassed tone, as if she had just handed him a meal of equal worth. He didn't eat. He didn't even open the lid. He pushed the container gently to the edge of his tray and folded his arms again. The woman beside him glanced once, then looked away quickly, shifting in her seat as if his presence had become a source of discomfort. Moments later, a child from the row behind walked past with his father toward the lavatory. As they passed Keon's seat, the child glanced down, giggled, and said something under his breath that made the father chuckle. Neither of them stopped. Keon's presence had become so marginalized, so minimized by design, that even a child understood he was a target. He wasn't feared. He wasn't even hated. He was dismissed. After a while, an announcement crackled through the cabin, asking for tray tables to be cleared and seats to be returned to upright positions in preparation for descent. The flight attendants moved quickly, collecting trays and cups, speaking with brisk courtesy. When they reached Keon's row again, the sandwich tray remained untouched, still at the edge of his table. The same attendant returned and looked at it with a faint sneer. She didn't ask whether he had finished. She didn't ask if he wanted anything else. She simply took it, as if collecting garbage, and moved on. The plastic snapped against the edge of the cart, landing among other discarded containers. Keon watched her go, his face unmoved. He had nothing left to say. Not because he was broken, not because he had accepted defeat, but because the system feeding the cruelty required his response to give it meaning. His silence denied them that. As the aircraft began its gradual descent, the captain's voice filled the cabin, cheerful and clear, providing local time, weather, and landing procedures. Seatbelt signs lit again. Passengers began to stir, gathering belongings, folding blankets, and refreshing faces with wipes and sprays. Keon remained still. His satchel remained missing. His name still hadn't been corrected in the manifest, and despite every opportunity for a correction, for an apology, for a moment of decency, none had come. The cruelty had not emerged as a single act of aggression. It had unfolded as a tapestry of minor violations stitched together by intent. Every skipped service, every delayed document, every wordless dismissal had been part of a script rehearsed not just by Meredith Langley or the flight crew, but by a world that had decided what value someone like Keon-san should be. Assigned without ever knowing him. The final insult came 10 minutes before landing. A flight attendant walked briskly through the cabin with a clipboard in hand, pausing at certain rows, checking names and signatures. She stopped at Keon's row and stared at him with a look not of anger, but of scripted authority. She asked with artificial calm whether he had attempted to interfere with the lavatory lock earlier in the flight. The accusation came without context. Keon blinked, stunned not by the question, but by its audacity. He responded simply, a calm denial, and added that he hadn't left his seat except when ordered by the crew. The woman did not apologize. She wrote something on her clipboard and left. That moment, more than any other, encapsulated everything he had experienced. Not content with erasing him, they had now fabricated a reason to question his integrity. It was a final attempt to define him before the plane touched ground. But Keon understood what was happening. He fastened his seatbelt and sat tall as the aircraft began its final descent. The woman beside him tucked her purse close and didn't say goodbye. The attendants gave safety reminders, smiled at select rows, and passed him by again. When the wheels touched the runway and the tires screeched softly against, but Keon didn't move. He remained still, waiting, letting everyone exit ahead of him. Not because he was scared, not because he was defeated. Not just the missed meals, the denied access to personal items, the fabricated accusations, or the humiliating inspection, but the structure of how it had all unfolded, the intentional precision of a system designed to target quietly while appearing neutral. Keon knew this wasn't chaos, it was choreography, carried out with the kind of exactness that left no fingerprint. The flight attendants moved like stagehands, resetting the cabin, barely glancing at him, their expressions cleared of concern or awareness. His name had been erased, his needs dismissed, and his identity assumed. What they didn't know, what none of them had even considered, was that the boy they had cast aside carried more weight than any of them could comprehend, and the moment for silence was ending. When the aisle began to clear, Keon remained seated. The crew exchanged glances, expecting the ignored passenger in 27B to rush off like the rest, but he didn't move. One attendant gestured at him impatiently, her voice curt as she asked if he needed assistance. He responded calmly that he was waiting for his documentation and belongings. Her mouth tightened at the mention of the satchel, and she turned to whisper something to a colleague. Moments later, a junior crew member returned with Keon's bag, setting it down without explanation or apology. The leather was scuffed now, the corners dented. It had been searched, handled, and tossed aside without care. Keon opened it methodically, checking the contents one by one: passport, tablets, signed credentials, authorization letters. Everything was intact, though disordered. A quiet sign of invasion. He zipped it shut and stood slowly, stepping into the aisle as the last few passengers made their way out. At the jet bridge, a uniformed staffer waited with a clipboard, eyes darting to the manifest. The flight crew had clearly noted something about him, some last-minute annotation that set off the chain of procedural monitoring. Keon presented his boarding pass again, watched as the staffer's eyes scanned the name, and immediately flicked up in confusion. There was a hesitation, a moment of recognition, the staffer asked him to hold, stepping aside to call someone. Keon remained patient, his voice stayed level. No emotion surfaced. The flight attendant stood nearby, watching. Meredith Langley had not exited yet, but she lingered in the front cabin. Her presence felt like an invisible pressure. When the staffer returned, his posture had changed. It was subtle, but noticeable. There was no apology, only a statement that Keon would be escorted to the lounge for assistance with customs clearance and transfer. He was not told why. He didn't need to be. He walked beside the staffer in silence, his satchel over his shoulder. the other passengers disappearing behind glass walls and security gates. The corridor ahead was quiet, distant from the buzz of the main terminal, leading into a VIP suite with frosted doors and a security checkpoint manned by 2 uniformed officers. Inside, a private immigration agent waited with a tablet, ready to verify incoming documentation. Keon handed over his passport and a separate envelope from the inner lining of his bag. The agent's face shifted slightly upon reading it. There was no question of its authenticity. There was no hesitation. With a few taps, the screen lit up with a profile that contained far more information than a standard passenger's manifest. Keon was not an ordinary traveler. He was the son of Harrison Stratton, chairman of Stratton Global Aerotech, a multi-billion-dollar aerospace defense corporation whose signature had recently been placed on a pending $2.8 billion joint zero-cents joint venture with Altair Airlines' parent company. The very plane he had just exited was part of that upcoming fleet deal, and the boy they had spent an entire flight ignoring, humiliating and degrading, was its designated heir, traveling incognito on a compliance route under strict non-disclosure, assessing treatment and procedural transparency before finalizing the contract. The moment the agent confirmed the identity, the tone changed completely. The attending officer excused himself, the staffer's eyes widened, and a quiet murmur traveled through the corridor as the message spread. Within minutes, Meredith Langley was called forward, her name requested via direct line from operations. She arrived with her polished demeanor intact, but the color drained from her face when she entered the lounge and saw Keon standing there, calmly, documents in hand. She tried to hide it, the subtle twitch of discomfort behind her eyes, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. The officer handed her a printed record of the flight manifest changes, highlighting where Keon had been removed from his original seat, reassigned without cause, denied meal services, and flagged incorrectly for a security check. Her skeleton whitened and composed, but her knuckles whitened as she held the paper. Keon didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer the silence of exclusion. It had become the silence of undeniable truth. The security officer asked him if he had any statements to submit regarding his treatment on board. Keon paused, then replied calmly that he had logged every moment, every incident, and every denial in the flight's digital access system, linked directly to the Stratton evaluation team monitoring procedural compliance. A second envelope, smaller than the first, was handed to the officer, containing timestamped documentation and personal notes. The officer received it like a ticking device, careful and alert, immediately passing it to another staffer to file for review. Meredith remained silent, unable to respond. She had no authority in this space, no shield of routine, no backup from colleagues trained to look away. She stood stripped of power, facing a young man who had let her show her truest self before revealing his. Keon adjusted his satchel and made for the exit of the suite, passing her without a glance, the hallway parting quietly before him. Behind him, Meredith exhaled sharply, her expression twisting between pride and regret, and for the first time the gravity of what she had done seemed to settle on her. The system she had once controlled had turned inward, and now every action she had taken was about to be examined under a microscope she couldn't manipulate. The revelation of his identity had shifted the balance, not just among the flight crew who had mistreated him, but throughout the upper structure of Altair Airlines itself. His journey, once anonymous by design, had transformed into a precise and measured reckoning, and those responsible were now exposed beneath a spotlight they could not dim. Inside the executive wing of the terminal, beyond glass doors and biometric locks, the regional boardroom had been prepared in haste. The pending $2.8 billion, 0 cents Stratton Altair deal, meant to finalize over the next quarter, now hung in fragile balance. What was intended to be a celebratory handshake was now a crisis mitigation session. The individuals assembled inside had not expected this. They had expected briefings, perhaps negotiation terms, but not a direct confrontation triggered by a passenger incident. And certainly not one involving the very person who held power over the deal's future. When Keon entered the boardroom, silence fell with a weight that sucked the air out of the space. Around the polished oak table sat 6 executives, including Altair's regional vice president, compliance officer, legal liaison, and client strategy lead. Standing behind them, eyes lowered and demeanor subdued, was Meredith Langley. Her uniform still crisp, but her posture changed, no longer that of command but of guarded submission. She stood with her arms folded, not out of defiance, but to keep herself from visibly trembling. She had been summoned the moment the Stratton documentation was verified, and had spent the last hour in a back office facing escalating questions from both corporate counsel and security staff. Now, she was to face the very person she had quietly degraded for the duration of an 8-hour flight, believing him beneath the succern. Keon said nothing as he entered. He moved to the far end of the table and remained standing. One of the executives cleared his throat and began a practiced apology, but Keon raised his hand gently, stopping him. His voice was calm, even, measured. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stated what had happened. A platinum-level first-class passenger was denied boarding under a false procedural claim, reassigned without justification, denied all standard amenities, subjected to targeted humiliation, and falsely accused of misconduct. All without a single act of provocation. His tone never rose. He detailed the sequence like a report, stating times, names, and observable facts, referencing the notes stored in his device, which he now placed on the table for corporate review. The executives listened, shifting uncomfortably as the timeline unfolded. The compliance officer began to speak in an attempt to contextualize, to deflect toward policy, confusion, but Keon interrupted him softly. There had been no confusion. There had been choice. Meredith had made hers at the gate, and her crew had followed suit without question. He then turned toward her slowly. Their eyes met for the first time since She didn't look away, but the confidence behind her eyes had fractured, her certainty leaking through the cracks in her controlled expression. Keon didn't accuse her with malice. He stated what she had done in full, in front of her superiors, without adding insult to her injury. He didn't need to embellish the truth. The truth, laid bare, was more damning than any outburst could have been. The regional vice president leaned forward, face taut with tension. He asked what Keon intended to do. That was the moment the room shifted again. Keon explained that this journey had been a test, a compliance shadow assessment designed by Stratton Global to evaluate Altair's operational integrity at ground and crew levels, under conditions of anonymity. Every interaction had been recorded internally through biometric logging and encrypted observation notes, set to trigger formal review upon his return. He was not merely a passenger, he was the final evaluator of a multi-billion-dollar integration initiative. The room fell silent again, not out of surprise anymore, but out of dawning consequence. Meredith's face drained of remaining color. She had not merely made a mistake, she had compromised her airline's most critical pending deal through unchecked bias and unchecked power. Keon stated that while he could demand termination, public acknowledgement, and systemic restructuring, he wasn't interested in retribution for its own sake. He wanted accountability, not just for Meredith, but for the culture that made her decisions possible, routine, and invisible to others. He wanted written acknowledgement of the incident, binding commitments to personnel retraining, updated boarding protocols, and monitored inclusion metrics across all clients. And he wanted this incident logged under the Stratton compliance records as part of the final contract negotiation. The executives nodded, some reluctantly, some ashamed, all understanding that they were now responding not to a teenager but to the voice of institutional power that had just exposed their blind spots. Meredith attempted to speak, her voice now stripped of its performative polish, wavered as she exploded regret. The damage was real, not just in reputation, but in the structural confidence investors and partners required to support a multi-billion-dollar merger. By mid-morning, internal reviews had begun, starting with the senior cabin crew's conduct and expanding to every point of procedural failure logged in Keon's compliance file. No longer was the incident an isolated issue tied to a single flight. It had become a systemic case study for everything wrong with Altair's front line. Emails flew between legal, HR, and operations with the kind of urgency normally reserved for disaster response. They weren't scrambling because a passenger had been wronged. They were scrambling because that passenger held the power to pull their future contract from beneath them with a single nod. Meredith Langley was pulled into a private session with internal ethics counsel and 2 senior investigators from Altair's personnel integrity unit. Gone was the aura of polished control, replaced now with a disoriented edge. She answered their questions, admitted the sequence of decisions she had made beginning at the boarding gate, each one layered upon a bias she refused to acknowledge until now. She had no real defense. There was no confusion, No staffing shortage, no system error. She had seen a black teen traveling alone in a premium boarding tier and had assumed something didn't add up. She hadn't verified his details because she had already made up her mind. The investigators logged every word, and her personnel file was flagged for disciplinary action pending executive review. While no one said the word terminator, the silence surrounding the outcome left little doubt about the direction this was heading. Meanwhile, the remaining flight crew involved in Keon's mistreatment were placed under immediate administrative review. Every member of the cabin team from that flight was pulled from active duty and instructed to complete incident reports detailing their actions, observations, and justifications. As the reports were compared to Keon's documentations, inconsistencies began to emerge. Manifest access logs showed when Keon's name was removed from his original seat assignment and when his dietary preferences were erased from the system. Surveillance footage from the jet bridge confirmed that his boarding was delayed and visually verified the moment Meredith diverted him to economy. Additional footage from within the plane showed the beverage service skipping his row, the sandwich tray being handed to him, and the galley inspection, where he was forced to remove his shoes. None of the footage contained aggression. That was the part that made it more damning. It was all too calm, too controlled, too precise. It was policy weaponized by assumption, courtesy used as a mask for contempt. Altair's PR division met in crisis mode, strategizing on how to contain the narrative before it could reach public channels. The Stratton Group had not threatened to go public, but any misstep in response could change that instantly. Behind closed doors, Altair's general counsel prepared a statement of accountability to be shared privately with Stratton Global. The statement would acknowledge failure, detail immediate corrective actions, and request continued partnership with promises of transparent reform. Simultaneously, Stratton Global's senior counsel requested access to employee records, training logs, and diversity metrics for all frontline personnel. It was a signal. Keon's testimony would not be a standalone complaint. It would become the blueprint for contract renegotiation. By noon, Meredith was escorted from the headquarters through a side entrance, her badge disabled, her access revoked. No press surrounded her, no headlines tracked her, but within the industry, her name had become the case number for failed judgment. The airline hadn't yet decided on final discipline, but her leadership days were over. Even if her employment survived the review, her credibility would not. A once celebrated training supervisor, now cited in a corporate ethics report as the initiating source of an incident that nearly derailed one of the largest defense transport partnerships in a decade. Across terminals, in administrative towers, and back offices, other staff took notice. The silence that had once allowed these biases to move freely through corridors now stood challenged. Keon hadn't shouted. He hadn't recorded videos or posted live complaints. He had simply remembered everything, written it down, and delivered it to the exact place that could not ignore him. Elsewhere, senior management of Stratton Global gathered in their own headquarters, several time zones away, analyzing the developments. Their trust in Keon's role as an undercover evaluator had paid off more clearly than expected. He had not only documented how bias could manifest in elite service environments, but also how procedures could be used as barriers rather than protections. His experience now served as undeniable leverage. The defense deal would move forward, but not without stipulations. The air outside the airport hung with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the wind itself had paused to acknowledge the weight of what had transpired within those towering terminals and sterile meeting rooms. Keon Stratton stood at the edge of the departure roadway, hands in his pockets, his breath slow, his eyes calm but focused, watching the swirl of taxis, shuttles, and luggage carts move in endless patterns. Behind him, the building he had entered in silence hours ago now echoed with the aftershock of recognition. It was not revenge he carried in his chest, nor the hollow satisfaction of besting those who had wronged him. It was something heavier, something more rooted in purpose. The kind of clarity that came only after enduring something meant to strip you of your voice and learning instead how to make silence speak louder than noise. In the days that followed, Keon returned to Stratton Global headquarters, where senior evaluators and compliance directors reviewed his report in full. They didn't question his findings. They didn't press him for more. The evidence spoke with precision, and the implications of Altair's misconduct had become too large to suppress. His experience became a cornerstone document in Stratton's internal ethics seminars, and without being named publicly, His journey was transformed into a required case study for leadership training across Stratton's global network. But beyond the polished boardrooms and analytic debriefings, change began elsewhere, quietly, personally, in the shadows of those who had once played a role in his dismissal. Meredith Langley sat alone in a quiet HR office days after her removal, waiting to speak with the internal oversight committee that would determine whether her career at Altair had reached its end. She had prepared for every possible line of questioning, except the one that mattered most. Why? Why did she do it? Why did she make a decision at the gate based not on facts, not on protocol, but on a series of invisible calculations she had absorbed over years without ever challenging them? She had stared at Keon that day and seen only what her bias allowed her to see. Not a passenger, not a professional, not a son. She had seen what her assumptions wanted to see: a problem, a deviation, a threat to order. And in doing so, she had betrayed everything her role was supposed to uphold. It would have been easier to blame training, policy ambiguity, even fatigue. But none of that would be true. Her failure was personal. Her failure was hers. The committee did not terminate her. Instead, they suspended her license and placed her on mandatory cultural rehabilitation, a comprehensive accountability initiative crafted by Stratton's equity division. It wasn't a punishment, it was a challenge. The program wasn't designed to check boxes or meet quotas. It was designed to unravel the comfortable myths of professionalism that shielded personal bias. It required participants to confront stories like Keon's, not read them, not memorize them, but sit through them in unfiltered detail, to understand the layered impact of actions that felt small in the moment, but carried enormous weight. Meredith accepted the placement, not because she wanted to reclaim her position, but because something had shifted inside her that could no longer be ignored. She remembered his silence, not defiant, not smug, but precise, as if he had known from the start that the story would reach this moment. She had once been praised for her efficiency, her poise, her discipline under pressure. But those traits had become tools of exclusion when, driven by unexamined prejudice. Now, she would learn what discipline truly required. Months passed. Altair Airlines announced a new ethics transparency initiative developed in partnership with Stratton Global. It wasn't marketed as a response to scandal. It wasn't dressed up in corporate language. It was simply a shift in process, one that included anonymous passenger shadow evaluations, vibrations empowerment audits, and executive-level accountability check-ins. The airline's image didn't recover overnight. Reputation repair was a slow and painful road. But change had begun, not in statements, but in structure. Keon received letters from mid-level employees across the airline, some apologetic, some grateful, some honest about how blind they had been. He didn't reply to most of them. Not because he held resentment, but because the point had never been personal vengeance. The point was that someone had to feel what it meant to be seen wrongly and to see it through until the system that allowed it cracked open. On a clear winter morning, Keon returned to the city where the flight had originally departed. Not for business, not for compliance. He returned to visit a local youth advocacy center that Stratton Global supported quietly. He met with young people who reminded him of himself, curious, determined, full of questions about the world but unsure of their place in it. He spoke with them about resilience, about dignity, about what it meant to carry your truth into rooms where people might try to strip it away. He didn't tell them about the flight. He didn't have to. The lesson wasn't in the story. It was in the way he carried himself, the way he responded without judgment. Later that week, he received a handwritten letter, forwarded from the Stratton office. It was from Meredith, not official, not formulaic. It was personal, written in careful script on simple paper. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't defend her choices. She simply wrote what she had realized, how easily she had let fear masquerade as procedure, how deeply she regretted allowing the small voices in her head to speak louder than the truth in front of her, and how much she had begun to understand only after being stripped of her authority. She had started volunteering at a center similar to the one Keon had visited. Not to fix anything, not to undo the damage, but to learn in a space where she was not the one holding the clipboard. She ended the letter by saying she hoped, one day, to earn the right to be seen differently, not by the world but by herself. Keon folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer beside his desk. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Redemption wasn't about recognition. It was about choosing to live differently once you knew better. And for Keon, The victory was never in the punishment of those who had wronged him. It was in forcing the world to stop, to look, and to understand that cruelty could wear a smile and a uniform just as easily as it wore a slur or a shout. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes, it arrived in a boy sitting still on a plane, waiting for the system to reveal itself, and when it did, holding up a mirror that couldn't be ignored. The story didn't end with one flight, or one meeting, or one policy change. The story continued every time someone looked at a stranger and chose to see a person instead of a problem. It continued every time silence became a tool for truth instead of a weapon of erasure. This is not your... And it would continue as long as people like Keon, carrying quiet strength, refused to disappear in the face of injustice. He had not been loud. He had not fought with fists. He had waited, endured, and then shown them exactly who he was. Not just a name on a manifest, not just an heir to power, but a reminder that every act, however small, either sustains the lie or exposes it. He had chosen to expose it, and in doing so he had changed more than a flight. He had changed the people who thought they knew what authority meant. He had taught them that justice doesn't always look like a verdict. Sometimes, it looks like a young man, seated, calm, unshaken, who simply refuses to be erased. The end. If you connected with this story and want to see more gripping narratives that challenge injustice and reveal hidden truths, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring these stories to life. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think about the plot twists and how everything unfolded? Was there a moment that hit especially hard or made you rethink something? It's always powerful to see how far these stories can reach. Let's talk.